Welcome, Adewawai family, and everyone that are joining us today from around the world. I am Diakon Ephraim Magenta, and I am here with my sister Hewitt, my co-host. Again,
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today. Please stay tuned. We have a great program for you today. This week, as we all know, Ethiopia mourns an iconic Oromo singer. Hachalu Hundessa, 34 years old, a young man, a father, husband, activist, and an artist whose song had galvanized a movement that succeeded in being one of the most profound voices in pushing Ethiopia to a democratic reform, has passed away. Our sincerest sympathy, love, and prayers are with his family and Ethiopia as we mourn his loss. Not only his innocent life was lost, but following his death, more than 90 innocent civilians, and more to count still, have been lost through unrest in Ethiopia. This should never happen in Ethiopia. The words of God tells us, "You shall love your neighbor as yours, but if you bite and devour one another, beware lest you be consumed by one another." Galatians chapter 5, verse 15. With that said, today we will be talking about Ethiopia and what it means to be Ethiopian. I will introduce my co-host Hewitt, that will introduce our great guest that we have for you today.
Welcome, everyone. If you're just joining us, you're watching our Viewers Digest. Today, we have invited Professor Ephraim Isaac to talk with us about what it means to be Ethiopian at home and abroad, who Ethiopia is from the historical and biblical perspective, and how we could deal with self-imposed civilization and the consequences of that, and also being able to discuss the hope of peace and unity that comes with fully understanding Ethiopia and what it means to be Ethiopian. Thank you and welcome, Professor Ephraim Isaac.
Thank you very much. I thank you very much, my sister.
Before going into, first of all, it is a great honor, Professor, again, to be with you this afternoon. Just before we go on and ask the first question, I would like to remind our audience who Professor Ephraim, which most of us know. Professor Ephraim Isaac is a scholar of ancient Semitic languages and civilization and African Ethiopian language and religion. He's the director of the Institute of Semitic Studies at Harvard University and the chair of the board of the Ethiopian Peace and Development Center. Born in Ethiopia, where he received his early education. To mention a few of his achievements, we could say Professor Isaac holds a Bachelor of Divinity and PhD in Near Eastern Languages from Harvard University, Harvard Divinity School, and honorary doctorate of literature from Addis Ababa University. He's a founder and the first professor of Afro-American Studies at Harvard University. And in recognition of what he has done and his merits, the Ephraim Isaac Prize to Excellence in African Language is given to a Harvard graduate who writes the best essay in African studies. And again, it is a great honor, Professor, to be with you today. Without further ado, we're going to ask you the first question, which is on top of many of Ethiopians, especially nowadays and at this moment. What is Ethiopian? What does Ethiopia or Ethiopian mean to you, Professor?
Thank you, Diakon Ephraim. I'm glad we share a name.
It is an honor, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you. To me, since I came to America, it's almost 55 years. I have been a very proud Ethiopian, to the extent that after all these years, I still carry an Ethiopian passport. Many people don't know that.
Wow.
I'm a permanent resident. And why? It's because I'm proud of the culture of Ethiopia, of the philosophy and religion. attitude of the people of Ethiopia, which is a people since ancient times known as a tolerant, just, and hospitable people. So said Diodorus Siculus. Egypt is called by Herodotus the gift of the Nile. And the Nile is, in a way, what makes Egypt what it is. And it comes from Ethiopia largely. So I am a very proud Ethiopian because I studied the history and the culture of the Ethiopian people. And that means for me, although people may speak different languages, and maybe, of course, there was an official church, yet there were Jews, Muslims in Ethiopia. They all lived on this piece of land called Ethiopia. We all grew up living and breathing the air of this particular region of the world. We all ate food that grows on that earth. We all were educated in the schools in that particular country. I am very proud as an Ethiopian because from my childhood days, the ordinary Ethiopian people, the people whom you call the poor people of Ethiopia, were very friendly, hospitable, giving people. And there is another dimension of Ethiopia which makes me very proud. It's a land that has an ancient history of complex groups of people who have interacted and lived together in peace. Jews, Christians, Muslims, Amharic speakers, Oromo speakers, Tigray speakers. Mind you, I'm not saying Amhara, Tigray, Oromo. I'm saying Amharic speaker, Tigray speaker, Amharic speaker, Gorage speaker, Somali speaker, Afar speaker. And yet these people have lived together, accommodating each other. Let me add that when a man and a woman get married, they may come from different backgrounds. One may be tall, one may be short, one may be light colored, one may be dark colored, yet they make a covenant. And that through that covenant, they become a family. No two people are 100% identical. And in our country, in Ethiopia, there are towns, there are villages, there are areas, people have much in common, just like the man and a woman who get married. Yet we also have diverse languages, diverse habits, but we've lived on this piece of land that God has given us together, and we have shared its bounties, we have eaten its food, and we have become a family. And so for me, to become an Ethiopian, culturally, historically, and many different ways, is a very important thing. Historically, again, we are people who share much overlapping, I didn't say identical, but overlapping culture. And that is what is interesting. We are people whose languages originate from one original Proto-African, Afro-Asiatic languages 10,000 years ago. We call it Proto-Afro-Asiatic. All the languages spoken in Ethiopia today are from Proto-Afro-Asiatic, from 10,000 years ago. It developed in Ethiopia. Some of it spread into Egypt, into North Africa, into the South. And I can say much more about the language we speak, the food we eat, the clothing we wear. Some similar, some not similar. But in fact, their similarity brings us together. Even their dissimilarity also enriches us because we have in this world different beautiful colors, green, yellow, red. And therefore, that diversity makes our people rich. I always have believed very strongly that diversity should not be a cause of separation and enmity. On the other hand, a cause of beauty, just like green flower, yellow flower, blue flower, red flower are all beautiful by themselves. but together in a bouquet, they are even more beautiful. They are flowers, all of them, yet maybe different colors. And therefore, I would say, for people who think that our diversity separates us, for me, our diversity enriches us because we each contribute the different colors, the different overtones of the sounds, the music, the blue, the green, the yellow. And so for me, in short, then, an Ethiopian means people of an ancient history who shared much in common, speaking different language, sometimes the same languages, eating the same food or sometimes different foods, but who have shared a long, long history for over 3,000 years. I can say much more. I don't know if I confused anybody. You can ask me a question and maybe I can make it clearer.
No, I love that. That's a very holistic view of what it means to be Ethiopian. To build on that, I want to ask you, who is considered Ethiopian? In a sense, when we're talking about Ethiopians that live in Ethiopia, right? Their day-to-day life reflects that identity. Whereas us who live abroad, maybe migrated here, or we're first or second generation, some of us may not even speak any of the languages that are spoken in Ethiopia, and our identification with what it means Ethiopia may not necessarily be reflected on our daily rituals or cultural practice that we do. In that sense, then, who is really considered Ethiopian?
Your question is a $10,000 question. Yeah. Well, it is true that today there are Ethiopians all over the world, in Europe, in America, in Africa, in Australia. And it's true that many Ethiopians have come to live in Germany and speak German. They live in France, they speak French. I remember a couple of years ago, my good friend, Ambassador Ratta Alamu, who is the ambassador of Israel to Israel, had brought about maybe 90 people from Washington, D.C. on 2 autobuses, on buses, to dedicate the book I have written called the Ethiopian Tewahedo Orthodox Church. And at the opening of the meeting, I started speaking in Amharic. Then people raised their hands and they said, "We don't understand. Can you speak in English?" These are young Ethiopians who were born in the area, which was very interesting. Fortunately, there was a Princeton University student of mine who was there. So I called her and I said, "Well, we'll pay you if you become the translator." So I continued to speak in Amharic, and then she continued to translate into English. You see, that was for me a very important lesson, that when people say that because I speak Amharic or Oromo or Tigray, we are different people. No, language is something we learn. And therefore, it's interesting that Ethiopians who now were born in Germany and speak German don't even understand Amharic, Oromo, Tigray, Gurage, or Somali. Ethiopians born in France, they speak French. And I know many, many such Ethiopians. Yet, why do they say I'm Ethiopian? Well, because in some ways, in some countries, being a member of a nationality is based on where you are born. Like in America, for instance, anybody born in America becomes an American. In some other countries, like in the Middle East, even if you're born there, you don't become a member of that community, let's say Saudi Arabia, whatever, because they believe they have an ancient connection with the people who have lived there for centuries. And so for me, to be an Ethiopian is to originate from that piece of the continent on Africa, on earth, either born there or parents born there, and people who shared the same breathing, the same air. And you see, air and the water is identical for us. Although, and most of us also eat the same kind of food, some diversity, but diversity is important, as I said before. Even when I eat, even in any restaurant, I just don't like to eat just potato. I like to eat green peas. I like to eat rice. So that they are all, however, food. So the fact that we are all grounded on this piece of land called Ethiopia, the fact that we all share a long history, complicated history, interactions of people, of languages. And let me just summarize by saying it's very interesting that Ethiopia has been a symbol of an tolerant intercultural people for centuries. About 400 years ago, a man called Damiao Dagoes, a very famous man, who was a student of Erasmus. If you all know who Erasmus is, a founder of the Renaissance in Europe, met a group of Ethiopian monks in Portugal, and he interviewed them. He came to learn about their views about people, about language, about religion, and he wrote a book. And the book is called Fides Religio Moresque Ethiopium, which means the faith, the religion, and the culture of the Ethiopian people. Mind you, this is written about 1523, about almost over 400 years ago. What does the book say? The book says, I have met people who come from a country called Ethiopia. They tell me that in that country, there are people who speak different languages, who have different Christians, Muslims, Jews, but yet they are a solid people who live together in peace. They respect each other. And he says, here in Europe, we fight each other. Even the same people who speak the same language, we fight with each other. We kill each other. Why do not we learn from these people called Ethiopians about how to live together in peace, even if we speak different languages or follow different religions? Very impressive for me. It's interesting because at that time, the Catholic Church did not like to hear this. They didn't want a criticism of Europe as intolerant, and here an African country is an example of tolerance. So the Pope ordered the book to be prohibited, to be read. It was in Latin language. A couple of centuries later, Johnson, who wrote Rasselas, found the book and translated it into English. But since that time, the book has remained just in the Latin language and that particular translation. I wish some Ethiopian today, if they don't know Latin, there is a Johnson's English translation, and translate it into Amharic and Oromo and Tigrinya and other languages, so that the people of Ethiopia will hear that 400 years ago, Ethiopia was presented as an example of a people of different culture, language, and so on, but yet a tolerant people who live together in one nation. And I'm very, very proud of that. By the way, I'm not quite sure, but I read someplace recently that even Martin Luther King, no, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, had also read about this and kind of said Ethiopia is an exemplary, tolerant people. So others who have come to Ethiopia also have seen that our people live together. Sometimes we fight with each other. But let me hasten to add, you see, fighting with each other has nothing to do whether we are one blood, one language, one culture. It's unfortunately a human issue. In America, I know personally, two brothers who want to kill each other. I knew a young lady from Harvard who hated her parents. And when she passed away, her mother did not come to the funeral. In other words, what I'm trying to say is what brings people together, what solidifies people together is a covenant. And what is this covenant? That we are a people who, through this covenant, we accept each other, regardless of the fact some of us are tall, some are short, some are light colored, some are brown colored, some are dark colored. Yet we have said we are Ethiopians and we are a people of one nation, one country, and we share many overlap. They don't have to be exactly identical, but we have overlapping culture which enriches our country, and therefore this question that you have raised really is not a question one should answer standing on one foot. It's a book. I think it's a. I'm glad you've raised this question. You've even taught me something. I'm going to think more about this and see how better I can answer that question.
No, you answered it perfectly well. I think we forget that the fight between us is just a human issue. It's not necessarily about our language or where we come from.
Thank you.
Which I really love.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you, Professor. Just to comment this, you kind of also answered one of my questions about like we tend to only know Ethiopia within the mindset or through the geographical debate that we know of Ethiopia within the last maybe 20, 30, or 40 years. But you've mentioned that Ethiopia, even in modern time, goes way back to 400 years, where others have actually written that it's a country of tolerance. So I'm going to move forward with the next question that I have for you. Kind of goes with what you mentioned, Professor, about the three. Something I actually learned about what you mentioned about Martin Luther, actually even writing about Ethiopians being tolerant. That's something I'm just learning. I was going to ask you about the three Abrahamic religion. The Judaism, Christianity, and a Muslim, and all three major religions being very close to Ethiopian history. I wanted to ask you, Professor, as a theology lecturer as you are, tell us a little bit about the biblical Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. Before I do that, let me underline what my sister said. She's quite right, that love, peace, living together is not just a matter of blood or family. It's a matter of covenant. And that is why I try to emphasize that I know people who are one family who hate each other. I know people who come from the same region and who hate each other. So this idea of coming together and has very little to do with what people think, that we are different people, we speak different language and different culture. It's a human issue, and how to deal with that is another problem. Anyway, to get back to your question, now refresh my memory again. Your question was about religions.
Biblical Ethiopia, like we a lot of times we mention and we're proud of that Ethiopia is mentioned more than 41 times in the Bible. 50. Yeah, it's
actually much more than that. I'll tell you why. Because the name Cush is mentioned about 50 times, and Cush was translated in the Septuagint as Ethiopia in the first Bible translation to the Greek language. Yet there are other names like Sheba. Mentioned in the list of genealogy of Noah, and the Shebans were also identified with Ethiopia. And there's another name called Hawila that scholars have said is actually northern Ethiopia. So if we add all these names, Cush, Hawila, and Sheba, Ethiopia is almost mentioned about 100 times.
Wow.
Okay. Now move forward with your question. Yes. What is interesting is Ethiopia is a land of the Bible. About 150 years ago, a German traveler by the name of Ratgens came to Ethiopia and traveled throughout Ethiopia. And in his book, he said, I am really surprised. I've been in many countries. When I got to Ethiopia, It reminded me of ancient Israel, the land of the Bible. I'm very proud of what Radiance wrote. It called Ethiopia like the living ancient Israel. Of course, many Ethiopians also believe we are heirs of ancient Israel. Secondly, let me point out that when the Bible was translated from Hebrew and Greek into many languages, they were, including Greek and Hebrew, the first languages to receive the Bible were about seven. Syriac, the Old Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Coptic, and Ge'ez. By the way, don't confuse Coptic with Ge'ez. Coptic is the language of ancient Egypt. It's amazing that today, in many universities, every scholar who studies the Bible and its biblical versions, trying to understand why do we read this line like that, why do we read, they have to study these 7 languages. And one of them is Hebrew. Why? Because the earliest translations may have been closer to the original Bible. So in that respect, this is considered one of the 7. Today, the Bible has been translated into almost 3,000 languages. One of the 7 important languages of the world that any scholar who wants to be an expert has to study that. Second to that, it's very interesting when many people received the Bible and the Bible was translated into their language. There were certain other books that were not in the canon. Canon meaning in the old list of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is 39 in the Christian or 27 of the New Testament. And these books are called Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Now, Apocrypha are 13 books. In the Ethiopian church, they are all included in the Bible. And most importantly, however, there are 2 important ancient Jewish books, the book of Enoch and the book of Jubilees. Now, these 2 books were translated into a few languages 2,000 years ago, into Aramaic, and they were written in Aramaic. They translated into Greek, into Coptic, into Latin. But they all disappeared, and they survive incomplete only in Ethiopic. Only in Ethiopic. There are fragments of these books found in Greek, fragments meaning like about 2-3 chapters, and Latin maybe about a few lines. And then we have discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls a few fragments of this book. But every scholar today who studies the book of Enoch and Jubilees has to know classical Ethiopic. Now, I hate to add to this that many scholars today believe that to understand the rise and development of Judaism 2,000 years ago and the rise and development of Christianity 2,000 years ago requires not only the knowledge of the Hebrew Bible, but also the knowledge of the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch today is studied in every major university that teaches the Bible because they have to compare some of the ideas about like life after death, which is not elaborated in the New Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, but in Enoch. Many examples. So Ethiopia, there is, by the way, a book called Ethiopia and the Bible. I don't know if you're familiar, by a man called Edward Ullendorf. I agree with him to a great part, but I don't always agree with some of what he says. Ethiopia and the Bible. Ethiopia is really, as Rajel says, the only existing example of ancient Israel. Of course, Ethiopians also believe that the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon gave birth to a son who became the first king of Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. It amazes me, really, how when you study this language, you find a large number of loan words from Hebrew and Ge'ez. And so to call Ethiopia the land of the Bible, only, let's say, second to Israel. And this is recognized not only by Christians, but by Muslims and Jews. And the first Muslims, in fact, came to Ethiopia too. And maybe you want to ask me that particular question, and then I can answer. But Ethiopia certainly is the land of the Bible and the prototype of ancient Israel, and the heir, as the book Kabranagas says, the heir of ancient Israel.
Now, Professor, maybe just if you want to add on this, Hewitt, if I could comment on just, it goes well with this. I've been thinking to ask you on the topic of Giz. Now we do have a little bit, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but we do have some universities and colleges that are offering Giz as a subject or some kind of degree or subject in college. One in DC, the Catholic University I know of. In German, we hear of that. But when we come back to our own country, why is it that the Greek and Hebrew have so much hype? If it's one of the 7 ancient languages, is it our fault that Giz is not up there where known in every university? Or is it that maybe the Greeks have done well introducing their language and keeping it intact with in the West and the East? Okay,
forgive me if before I answer that question, I complete your earlier question about also Ethiopia as the land of the Bible and its connection to Judaism and Islam also. I think it's important that I say a couple of words about that.
Okay.
As you know, 2,000 years ago, there were a large number of Jews who had come to Ethiopia. In fact, until about a century ago, when Eno Littman, the one who did the excavation in Aksum, interviewed people, they told him 2,000 years ago, 50% of our people were Jews, 50 are believing in the sun and the moon. And then Christianity came. So Ethiopian Judaism, Beta Israel, the people who have now migrated to Israel, have also a very important role in Ethiopia and the Bible. I can say much more, but since I want to answer your other question, regarding to Islam, also it's very interesting that Islam, as you all know, is basically based on Judaism and early Christianity. I always say, for anybody who has not read the Quran but read the Hebrew Bible, they already know 70% of what is in the Quran. The story of Moses, the story of David, the story of Jonas, and so on and so forth. And what happened is, in fact, in the early days of Islam, you all know the story about when the Prophet Muhammad was being persecuted in Mecca by his own tribe, the Quraysh. He fled to Medina, where there were Jews, because he identified with them. Medina was a Jewish city. Even the word Medina is from Aramaic. And he sent a large number of his disciples, including Jafar, his cousin, or relative, and some of a woman whom he later married, and very important people, to Ethiopia to seek refuge. And when they came before the king, and in fact, Amru ibn al-As, the opposition, who came to take them back to Mecca because they were against the traditional beliefs. They stood in front of the king and they spoke about their belief in one God and not eating, pork and so on and so forth. The king said, "Well, their religion is close to what we believe, so I'm not going to send them back to be punished." So Islam, from the early beginning, also considered Ethiopia a land that saved its religion. The first Muezzin Bilal and many of the early teachings. In addition, let me tell you this. There are several very important words that have come from the Aramaic language to the Giz language, which, by the way, are certain that Jews had come to Ethiopia. And the same words, let's say ta'ut, tabut, as an example, miswat, those words are believed to connect Ethiopia to ancient Judaism. And in the meantime, Islam has also borrowed some Giz terminology. Like, for instance, the pulpit is called al-mamar, and it comes from member in Ethiopian, never. And scholars have said this word must have been borrowed into Islam from Ethiopian. So a man called Jeffries has written a book in which he gives a lot of words that are inherited from Ethiopic into Islam. So what I wanted to say is the fact that Ethiopia is the land of the Bible, it also connects all the three religions. Okay, now to go back to your question. No, I would say actually Giz, you see, maybe most Ethiopians don't know this. This is highly respected in European universities. Unfortunately, instead of teaching, getting Ethiopians to teach, Europeans themselves are teaching. Going back to 100, 200 years ago, there was a chair of Giz studies at Leipzig. There was a chair of Giz studies in Paris, because they all recognized Giz, which they called Ethiopic also, as very important language, for which we learned some of the early versions of the Bible. So Giz became a very important and central language. Right here behind me now, I have something like 100 books, which are compilations of articles in German, in French, in Italian. And there were these articles I copied from libraries in Harvard, in Oxford, and places, and I didn't want to throw them away. So because I might lose them, I bound them into volumes. You can see those green books, those red books. There are about 100 of them. They're like articles from French language, from German language, from Italian language, and even some Russian. And these books, as I said, really the books that you see there are articles in many, many different languages about Ethiopian language, Ethiopic, about Ethiopic church, Ethiopic literature. So Ethiopic is highly respected. But the irony is they have not involved more Ethiopians to come and be the teachers of this language. In fact, another problem that developed after the Second World War, the West became more interested in Africa and colonial Africa. And could you imagine the chair of Ethiopian studies in Paris then changed into something else? Originally, it was the chair of Giz studies. And in London, they founded a chair of Ethiopian studies. And then again, they changed it when a white man who was the chair died, instead of hiring an Ethiopian to come and teach it. So having said that, today, any well-known, not the public in general, but any well-known scholar of Hebrew Bible, of the New Testament, of the book knows that Giz is very, and I get a lot of letters from people asking me, what does this particular word mean? Because by professors from Italy, from Germany, from Russia, in order to understand. So Giz as a language is highly respected in the academic circle. I hasten to add, sadly, in our own country, they say the prophet is not celebrated in his own country. Somehow or other, Giz is not, also many people, many more, Giz, and in our country, we don't really understand it, appreciate it, or respect it. That is why, in about, I don't know, 15 years ago, the Addis Ababa University decided to give me an honorary degree. Are you familiar with that, my brother Dean Ephraim?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am, Professor. I mentioned it in your introduction.
What about our sister Hirut? What?
No, I'm not. Could you clarify that for me?
Well, when Addis Ababa University wrote me saying that they decided to give me an honorary doctorate, of course, I was proud, and my university, I have received honorary degree from American universities. I said, okay, well, how am I going to react when they introduce me? And well, I said, I'm going to give a talk in the Giz language. Although my accent may not be that of the priests, I know grammar probably better than they do. So I wrote a 3-page lecture in the Giz language, and Professor Andreas, and nobody knew that I was going to speak in the Giz language until the last day, because I didn't want them to say, no, we don't want you to talk. So in the morning, I told Professor Andreas that I'm going to speak in the Giz language. He was shocked. And he said, no. He said, but people don't understand. I said, unfortunately, I have prepared an English translation of what I'm going to say, and you can read it after me. And so he had Ms. Walda Georgis, who was the head of the Ethiopian Institute of Ethiopian Studies or whatever, Addis Ababa University. So he gave her the copy. So after I gave the lecture in the Giz language, she translated. Why did I do that? Because, having studied at Harvard, where every year at graduation, the student who gets the best prize gives a talk, not in English, in Latin. You see, because they are proud of Latin as an ancient language. And so every year, I was at Harvard almost 20 years, and every year at graduation, I have seen the graduating student giving the talk in the Latin language. So I said, if my own university in Ethiopia is giving me an honorary degree, but the most honorable language of scholarship in Ethiopia is Giz, no two ways about it.
Yeah.
Therefore, I decided to give my talk in the Giz language. So in short, while it is true, maybe in Ethiopia, we're really not yet fully, well, by the way, after I gave that talk, I recommended in writing to Professor Andreas that there should be a department of Giz language in Ethiopian University. And both he and Ambassador Samuel, who was the vice president, liked the idea. And when I later asked if the department was created, they said, well, it's in the Ethiopian Studies department. Well, that's not enough. I don't know what they're doing today. Like in America, Greek, Old Greek, and Old language are not taught in the department called European languages. They have their own department called Greek and Latin. Classics, they're called classics. I think in Ethiopia, we do need, and I'll tell you why I have to add. Giz is not a problem of Amharic or Tigray or Somali. It's an ancient language that developed in our land. Everybody is entitled to it. Everybody. And therefore, having a department at the university that focuses on, and you know what? There is much, much more writing in Giz than in Amharic or in Tigray or in Oromo or in Somali. There is much more writing, and that writing is about ancient history, ancient culture, ancient religions, ancient peoples, and why not make a big department now? Only scholars in Europe, in Germany, Hamburg University, in Italy, they study these manuscripts. And of course, the unfortunate thing is, as I recently, by the way, apropos your what do you call it? Your expression of sorrow about the death of Natalie Undesa. I also share that sorrow, and I also share the sorrow of the death of George Floyd in America. And I'm bringing that up because in reaction to that, I have written a letter to a few people, including the president of Princeton University and the Institute for Advanced Study, saying, what do you expect if you do not teach the language and the literatures of the African people? If you do not show respect in academia, how do you expect the ordinary people who killed George Floyd to respect Black people, to respect the culture and history of Black people is fundamental, and universities should do that. So I'm bringing this as a footnote by way of expressing, of course, my sorrow about what's going on here in the United States, because my reaction is when we talk about racism in America, when we talk about the percentage of hatred that exists, part of that problem is deeply rooted in academia, which does not necessarily give respect to the languages and literatures of Africa. I'm talking about the United States. But in our own country, it is very important that all the languages that our people speak, like in Switzerland, they speak French, German, Italian, everybody interacts and they study those languages. And we should study. But this is, however, fundamental. I don't know if I answered your question or confused you.
No. Professor, it's a book type of answer. Thank you so much.
That's amazing.
A lot.
And Professor, I agree with your analysis of knowledge is power, and that knowledge is transferred through languages. And if we're not careful about the way we handle the languages in our own places and country, and a way to better understand what it means to be Ethiopian, we will be at a loss as far as understanding who we are. I think we're losing a large part of our understanding of as human beings and our place in this world, because we lack that analysis of the Giz language and not being able to have that access, especially in a big place like Addis Ababa University, where I would think it's so obvious to have Giz departments. But to build on to that, I want to follow up with a question that when we're talking about, homegrown ideals and homegrown knowledge, that we lack that ability to share and develop and make it readily available for people that are currently in the country, right? So what is the consequence of ignoring that and imposing foreign ideals and foreign way of living into our institutions, that being legal, that being educational, or any other institute we have? What are we losing, and what is the issue with that?
Thank you. I'll start by answering the last part of your question. In fact, much of the problem of Ethiopia today is based on the ignorance of lack of knowledge of our own history and dependence on works done by Europeans. And many Europeans have their own intention, divide and rule. And focusing, like I myself, in 1960, when I became president of the Ethiopian Student Union in America, the first one, there were people there. I didn't know what Amhara was, Tigray, or Oromo. Only later, reading European books written by Marcus, written by Ullendorf and others, I began to realize. But in fact, I now remember I became president, and a fellow called Ezra, and only years later I learned that he's from Eritrea. and there was another guy that the Bacho who learned later that he's Amhara. I didn't know that in that day. So in a sense, essentially, the problem that we have is the emphasis on our differences are as differences, instead of saying our differences are in fact complementary. In this respect, let me tell you one very interesting thing many people don't understand. Last year, I gave a lecture at Wallagga University. I also gave a lecture in Gondar University and Aksum University. But my lecture in Wallagga University was comparing Oromifa with Giz language and Hebrew language. Now, when we were children, we thought that Oromifa and Somali and they have absolutely no relationship. We thought that they were strange languages. Well, the more scholars study, the more they discovered that Oromifa is a member of the Cushitic languages, which is a member of Afro-Asiatic. And Giz is a member of Semitic, which is a member of Afro-Asiatic. And indeed, the more research we do, and so in my lecture, I pointed out what the phonetic relationship between Giz and Oromifa and Hebrew, the morphological, especially the morphology is what's important, not words, morphology, meaning like the declension of the nouns, the conjugation of the verbs, how very similar they are in Giz, in Oromifa, and so on. So this knowledge of language shows us that diversity is rich, but also diversity also brings us together. And I, in my Institute of Semitic Studies, we publish a journal called Journal of Afro-Asiatic Languages. Now, what are Afro-Asiatic languages? These are languages that originated in Ethiopia maybe about 10,000 years ago, that broke into ancient Egyptian, Berber, Cushitic, and Semitic. And the majority of these Afro-Asiatic languages are in Ethiopia. And therefore, we need to study. Education is really the basis that shows how our diversity is not poverty, it's riches. Diversity should not be enmity. Diversity should be complementary. Different tastes of food, different tastes of language. For me, that is why even when I was a little kid, I used to go to a marketplace, and I used to run into people who came from Western Wallaga, and they spoke the Nuer language, Anuak language, and we were little children. We were so fascinated by the way they were moving their mouth, talking in their and we enjoyed it very much. That's why I said, in fact, ended up learning language. For me, knowing how to speak in different language makes me very happy. I don't consider it like this language is better than that language, these people are better than that, better. I'm sorry I diverted myself at the beginning, and therefore I may have forgotten the core question you asked me. So if you ask me the core question, I will try to answer it.
Yeah, my core question was, what is the consequence of native colonization or colonization that we impose on ourselves by implementing Western ideals into our institutions, legal, economy, or even the day-to-day lives, where that doesn't necessarily reflect who we are as people?
It is an excellent question. And this is one I have actually spoken about, and I'm glad you're thinking about it. In fact, it is the outsiders, like, let's say, when Donald Levin wrote his book, Wax and Gold, and many Ethiopians read. And the problem is that Ethiopians who read this and believe them, all of a sudden, it made feel that Amhara and Oromo are so different people. When William Schack wrote the book of the Gurage, well, I can tell you a very interesting example. In 1971, 73, when I was teaching at Harvard, I took a leave and I went to Addis Ababa. I was the Director General of the Ethiopian Literacy Campaign, although I lived in America. And the students at the university invited me and to give a talk. And after the talk, there was a dinner. And at the dinner, there were several Ethiopians sitting. And one person says to me, by the way, he said, have you read the book by William Schack called The Gurage? And I said, yes. You know what? I'm a Gurage. And I didn't know that we Gurages are the really technological, whatever, people of Ethiopia. And I didn't know that. I said, wait a minute. You should be respectful of yourself as a Gurage. You don't need to read William Schack's book to tell me that. So what has happened is Europeans, I respect Europeans and I'm sorry for them. They've written books that have made it sound like that we are so different people. Like there is a book called The Invention of Ethiopia. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not.
Which?
The Invention of Ethiopia. In other words, Westerners who have written these books to make it sound like that we are different people, different cultures. When in their own continent, if you go to Switzerland, there are people who speak French, one in the West, German in the East, Italian in the South, but they consider themselves a solid country. And it's true, Europeans have become very small countries. In Russia, there are many languages that they speak. But when it comes to Ethiopia, the literature of the West. Now, that is why I appeal to young Ethiopians. Please study Ethiopian, this language, Oromifa, and all the other languages, and let us try to write our own history. In my own recent letter I'm writing to the president of Princeton, I am saying that, number one, the study of the language and literature of Africa is totally absent from the university. That itself is discriminatory. Secondly, even if university hires a person to teach something about Ethiopic or about other language, they hire a white person a white person less qualified than an African person. And so we have that, my sister, we really have a serious problem with this Eurocentric educational philosophy. And we need to wake up and say our young people must learn our own language, and our scholars should be scholars based on the knowledge. the old priests in Ethiopia who learned Kene, they're as sophisticated as professors at Harvard, from my point of view. I've been at Harvard 20 years, and I know the mentality of this, the education of these people, the sophistication. And where are they? Why are they not teaching our people? You see, so one major problem we have is still we are worshipping the West. I'm sorry to say that. Our political philosophy only. Like right now, last week somebody also interviewed me on radio, and they asked me about intertribal conflict in Ethiopia. I said, what intertribal conflict are you talking about? I said, I only know 2 tribes in Ethiopia. I only know two. He said, what are they? He said, the tribe of the elite, Western educated elite, and the tribe of the hungry, poor Ethiopians who may speak Arabic. Those are the only 2 tribes I know. What I'm saying is that some of our own educated people really are unfortunately misled by all this study that focuses on the differences among us rather than on similarities, and even if differences, how those differences could be complementary. And therefore, we are today, and indeed, the problem of Ethiopia really, and I honestly mean that, it's not between Amhara, Oromo, or Tigray. I said recently to somebody, said, Amhara elite are doing this. I said, I do not want to hear Amhara elite anymore. If you want to say Western educated elite, then I agree with you. Or call them even Addis Ababa elite. Yeah. I'm sorry. For me, the conflicts today in Ethiopia is not between Amhara, Oromo, and Tigray. Amhara, Oromo, and Tigray are poor people. I have traveled in Amhara, Oromo countries, regions, and I've only seen women carrying heavy wood on their back and a little baby on their front. Last year, when I was 2 years ago, when I was in Tigray, it was like that. When I was outside of Gondar, it was like that. I grew up in Wallaga, it was like that. Problem is that we Western educated people have been not studying Giz literature or the thinking of, even in Oromo language, we have a large number of proverbs, almost like Proverbs of Solomon. We have large number of stories. They may be oral, which are very educational, which are very moral, teachings of morality. How many Western educated Ethiopians are doing that? Even our university is not doing that. Only Europe. We're still worshiping Europe. I respect Europe, mind you. I mean, I'm not one of those people who hate anybody. And even when people say white people are racist, I don't say white people are racist. Some white people are racist. The majority of white people are not necessarily racist. But unfortunately, the minority, 2 racists, can burn down a house. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not trying to denigrate Europe, or I'm not trying to denigrate America, but I'm focusing on call upon young Ethiopians. Please study your own language, if it's Oromo, Tigray, and then study the local tradition, and then we will begin to respect ourselves. I don't know if I answered your question. Maybe.
Absolutely. I think there's something to be said about understanding my own culture, my own tradition from the people that live it, and then going ahead and reading commentaries written by foreign authors about how they understand that culture, as opposed to starting my study from the European perspective, from their own framework, and trying to understand my own people, which will create conflict, because we do have a different background of understanding and frameworks that we look at.
Sure. Now, the tribe I told you about is called Western Elite Tribe, I call them. What are they talking about? They're talking about, they're writing, quoting Marx, Lenin, Hobbes. They're talking about democracy, election. I believe in democracy and election. 90% of our people, do they even know what that means? The poor people? The language they talk is bread, health, education. The poor people, that is a language they understand. And then my Western educated friends, what I call this Western elite, or call them Addis Ababa elite, their heart is not open. It's not open to these poor people in the countryside who are opening their hands, crying for bread, butter, for health, whether they're Amhara, Oromo, Tigray, Gurage, Somali, Afar, and so on. How can we understand and respect those people? Some of us who are educated in the West really don't respect those people, you know. I myself, by nature, I really respect the ordinary people. And thanks God, He gave me that mentality. I respect those people. Why? Because they're innocent, they're kind-hearted, they are tolerant. I have traveled when I was a student throughout Wallaga, Gavugofa, Sidamo, as a translator for my high school students. I don't really recall once when anybody asked me, where do you come from? What tribe are you? What language? But I was a translator for these teachers. They were poor people. Then when I was doing my doctorate, I was interested in this literature, as you know, and particularly in the relationship between my father was born in Yemen, he was a Yemeni Jew, and they were the most knowledgeable Jews. They knew the Bible by heart. So I wanted to study the relationship between the Hebrew language and the this. And so when I was doing my doctorate in 66, 67, I traveled throughout Yonder, through Malibela, throughout Aksum. Really, I mean honestly, wherever I went, I don't remember people asking me, are you Amhara, Oromo, or Tigray? The people I met, they simply said, oh, you must have come from a faraway place. Are you hungry? Would you like to come in and have some food? Would you like to come and have coffee? These Western educated brothers of mine don't talk like that. And then when I became the Director General of the Literacy Campaign, well, I helped start this literacy campaign, which taught 2.5 million people, as you all know. From 1966 to 73, I was the Director General. I lived in America, but I stayed, and then I traveled in many parts of Ethiopia, the areas where you call Kurage, Walaita, Kambata. And I remember, in fact, a weekend in Kambata, I don't think any one single person came and asked me if I'm an Hamara or Romo or a Tigray. I don't really remember. And I don't think they did. But so why are we poisoning the mentality of our young people today by talking about narrow tribalism instead of talking about bread, medicine, hospital, education? Why are we not focusing our energy on that? So it makes me really very sad as a person who spent throughout the city, although I've lived in America, as I told you, I still remained an Ethiopian by nationality. And I've always felt that I should make a contribution to the land of my birth. And I've tried through literacy campaign, through the peace organization. And why? It's because of that 90% of the population of Ethiopia, 95%, because I know what their heart is like. I know their generosity, their hospitality, their love and friendship. It touches me because I've traveled all over the country. But then I come to Addis Ababa or I come to America. Oh, proletariat, democracy, election. I can rule. I want to rule. I know I rule Ethiopia. How sad when our people are dying tonight. Children are dying from disease. Children are dying from hunger. Children are dying from sickness. They're not growing up getting enough education to be productive farmers. And anyway, I'm very impressed, by the way. When many Western educated people, when they go back to Ethiopia, they don't even go back to their village. They're not going to go back to village. What I did is I grew up in a small town called Nejo in Waleka. And after I started teaching at Harvard, I had little money. I've been always called cultural millionaire, not money millionaire. So then, people were saying, "Oh, now you should build a house." I said, "Yes, I'm going to build a house." Where did I build a house? In Nejo and Laga, not at all in Addis Ababa. But yet many of my colleagues, they come back and only houses in Addis Ababa. I was so happy recently. There was a young lady called Mimi. Oh my God, I forget her name. She's from Goja, and she lived in England and she did, I think, a study of peace also. Really very impressive. And she's been in touch with me. And she's just gone back to Ethiopia. She's not going to live in Addis Ababa. She's going to live in a village in Goja, way out in the country. I said, for how long? I said, are you going to? No, I'm settling here. So that's what we need. Young Ethiopians like her. I'm embarrassed that her name escapes me because she's been in touch with me so much. She's a wonderful young lady, and I think her husband and children, I think they're all going to settle in a village, way out in the village, in Goja. And how many young Ethiopians, Western educated, are doing something like that? Not many. Everybody wants to cram Addis Ababa. Everybody wants to where the political center of the country. So I'm sorry, I'm giving you long answers for short issues.
No.
We love it. We love it.
Yeah, this is great, Professor. Thank you. And so now we've talked about some of the issues, and like you said, we could keep going on and on. The only thing we could do while talking about the issues is just burn our hearts. So now, like moving forward, what is your take that the new generation, sometimes, as you can see, it's hard to change those that, for example, for more than 65 years, since 1959, you've been working with Ethiopians abroad and around the world, trying to solve these issues, starting from the language of Giz and all sorts of ethnic problems. But in general, you like the main core, I think, problem that we have, and as you have emphasized, is the lack of knowledge, the lack of knowing who we are as Ethiopians. So do you believe we have the resources and ideology and experience to solve our problems with our own way, or do you think we will need to borrow other ideologies to fix these problems? And how do we move forward and make a better Ethiopia, where the next generation, or even this millennial and post-millennial generation, at least have some aspects of the understanding of who they are as Ethiopians? Because it was beautiful of how and heartbreaking of how you touched like George Floyd and the problems that African Americans face here in the United States. Is the same thing. It's the lack of knowledge, and the same thing is happening to us. But in this sense, we're doing it to ourselves. So how do we move from this, Professor?
Okay, in Greek,
what did the generation do?
In Greek, they say "gnostese auton," means know yourself. Know what the Greeks meant is that we are really all mortals. The beginning of knowledge is self-understanding. I will say for all young Ethiopians, before we even explore other lands, we should know ourselves, our own language, our own culture. We've not done that. Our universities have not done that at all. Which brings me to a book written by Dr. Yirga Galau. Are you familiar with his book, Native Colonialism?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I was a reader of that book. I was one of the doctoral sponsors of that book. I don't know, he mentions it. And Yirga also a wonderful person, friend of mine. He had heard some of my own lecture, in which I said, it's important that we know everything about the world. We should learn Chinese, Indian, American, and so on. But the first thing, however, is to know ourselves. And Yirga explains in that book, and it's something I've been preaching, as he himself will tell you, What happened in my day? I was at Haile Selassie, at that time it's called University College. I entered University College in 74. I studied 2 years before I came to America. Not a single course about Ethiopian history. I studied European history. I studied European philosophy. Nothing about Ethiopia. Then, in fact, I became interested in the study of Giz literature after I came to Harvard, and I went to the library and I saw all these wonderful books written by Germans, Italians, French, and they're all studying. I said, why don't I also? So I fortunately got some professors to agree with me. And so, as Jirga says, really the main problem of the young elite educated Ethiopian today is we don't know much about Oromo culture, Amara culture, Tigray culture. We don't know, fundamentally, we don't even know the Giz literature. He did his research in Lalibela, and that is a problem that goes back almost now 100 years. Now, it is important, of course. You see, I'm not narrow-minded. I'm living in America. I'm studying American languages, and I studied philosophy and so on. It's important we learn. And in fact, I started learning Chinese also. So it's important that we learn. But the beginning of knowledge is self-understanding. It's the fear of God, but it's also self-understanding, which means I wish that our leaders, even 100 years ago, had decided that in every Ethiopian schools, we study Giz language, Amharic, Oromifa, and so on, that we study our own language before we jump into becoming experts in Western civilization. That has hurt us a lot. Really, I remember when I was running the literacy campaign, this is not a new philosophy for me. 1966, 67, or is it 7? Yeah, I think so. I've been back, I go back and forth to Ethiopia almost every 6 months, especially during the literacy campaign. And I've lived there a year now. I lived there. And I remember asking an appointment to meet His Excellency Ato Akalawork, he was the Minister of Education. Ato Akalawork was also the brother of the Prime Minister Aklilu. And in my discussion, I always speak, I respect people and I speak politely. I said, Your Excellency, I said, I've now lived in America and I'm studying Giz and I'm doing this. The major problem that the Ethiopian education has. So when I was at Addis Ababa University for 2 years, then University College, I studied the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. I read about Kant. I read about Hobbes. I said, not a single course on Ethiopian language or literature. I said this now almost 50 years ago to His Excellency Ato Akalawork, Minister of Education. I went to talk to him about literacy campaign. Now, this, I said, is a serious problem. And he looked at me and he kind of agreed, or maybe half-heartedly agreed with me, but I still believe that is a major serious problem in our country. We don't study the languages and cultures of other primary. If you go to Israel, what are the first language, the first courses at the forefront? Hebrew language, Hebrew literature. Then, of course, English, German, and French also come. But if you go to Germany, what are the first courses in universities? Not about America, not about England, but German history, language, culture. Then the others come in. If you go to France, it's the same. But only Ethiopia, I know, where the first thing is America, Europe, and our own history, our own culture is way up at the bottom. And therefore, self-understanding begins with knowledge of self, the knowledge of our own people. And as I said, for instance, when I was in high school, I didn't know Oromifa had anything to do with Giz. In fact, part of the root of the hatred starts, so we are two different people, different language. Then as I come to Harvard, study ancient languages, comparative language, and discover that in fact Oromifa and Giz are descendants of the same Afro-Asiatic language 10,000 years ago. They were the same family. Well, you have to analyze it to understand this. My vision was completely different. It made me understand that Ethiopians, we have a similar root going back to 10,000 years. Whether you're Oromo speaker, whether you're Tigray speaker, Amharic reader, 10,000 years ago, we all spoke that one particular language called Afro-Asiatic, from which now, over the years, languages, what happens with languages is it depends on the area where you live. Like in America now, they speak English. But if you go to the South, sometimes I don't understand their English. Already, because of the distances, some of the accents and so on are different. And this is what happened over 10,000 years. Giz and Oromifa became a little bit different, more and more different. And just like German and English are really the same language. But over the centuries, they became far away from each other. So yet understanding that our root, our mother, is the same mother for all of us is very important. And our young people need to understand that. They need to explore that. They need to study that. I don't know if I answered your question about these. Could you please maybe enlighten me again?
Very well, Professor. It's answered very well. Not that we finished today. This is just, we're already 1 hour and 15 minutes in, but the conversation doesn't end here. We're going to continue having these conversations. Thank you so much, Professor. You've answered very well. Hewitt, you want to?
Yeah, I want to build on this conversation that we're having. I know earlier you mentioned that when you first got here and you started the Ethiopian community, the members in there that you knew and you lived with, you didn't know nor talked about their ethnic belongings and such. Whereas now, our ethnic identity is becoming the forefront, and most of the conversation is becoming that, not in a way that's beautiful, in a way that celebrates our unity and diversity. So what happened between then and now? And also, do you think there's a problem in which we talk about ethnicity in Ethiopia?
Thank you very much. That's a good question. Let me tell you, I came here as a student in 1957. And 2 years I studied in Minneapolis. I studied music too in those days, by the way. I translated Handel's Messiah and performed in the Emperor Haile Selassie's palace. And those days, there were 250 Ethiopians in America, including Canada, about 300. Today, we're almost like 500,000 in America. To me, it's like a dream. So when we were 250 students, we're spread all over America, from New York to California. So, and I was in Minneapolis, and there was a fellow called Ezra Gabramedin, who is now a Protestant minister in Sweden, Case Ezra, well, my dear friend. We were roommates at college for 2 years. There was Amare Gzau and my own brother too, I think. We said, we are so lonely. We are only 5 Ethiopians here in all of America. We don't even see any Ethiopian. No Ethiopian restaurant, no Ethiopian culture. So we said, why don't we try to form a group where we can at least get together once or twice a year? So we sat down and wrote a letter. First of all, we wrote to the embassy and said, could you please send us addresses of Ethiopians in America? And they sent us, I'm sorry, I didn't shut off my telephone, but don't worry about it. Yeah. And they sent us a list, but not complete. But we used some of this, and then we wrote to the few Ethiopians, said, do you know other Ethiopians? And we gathered about 200 list of Ethiopians in all of America, from California to New York. And then we decided in 1959 to meet in Chicago. In Chicago, 1959, at the University of Chicago. And they gave us a place. And we formed the first, it was called Ethiopian Student Association in North America. EZANA, we called it. And since I and Kesedra were behind this idea, they said, you become president. And I gave a lecture. I don't know, have you seen the lecture I gave those days, in 1960, 59? I'll send it to you if you send me your email, because I'll give that.
Please do, yeah.
I'll give the same lecture today. What I said is, if we Ethiopians come together, if we Ethiopians respect each other, work together, love each other, we can not only help each other here in America, where we are lonely and far away from each other, but we can also help our country to develop, and even the rest of Africa. I said that in 1959 lecture. And so we found that student organization. Then what happens is, we had the first exhibition of Ethiopian culture at Howard University in the summer of '60, where a man called Leo Hansberry, very interesting person, you can look his name up, he was interested in ancient Ethiopian culture, African American. And then after 2 years, I went to Ethiopia for a year. And when I came back, I again president of the organization. But a year later, I decided I've been already connected to the Ethiopian literacy campaign. And I said, I'm tired of talking. I said, we meet together and talk. We need to do. So they said, what should we do? I said, let's form a committee called Committee for Ethiopian Literacy. And I said, we can raise money in America. So what happened is, and there was a Professor John Spencer, many Ethiopians know his name, who was teaching at TAPS. I went to him and I said, can you please help us get a tax exemption? We're going to raise money to help Ethiopia become literate, which was very interesting. Of course, Professor Spencer was very kind. So we got the tax exempt in 1963, the first Ethiopian African organization to get tax exemption in America. So we started, I myself then became chairman of the Committee for Ethiopian Literacy, and started focusing on education. On the other hand, what happened is my successors, 4 of them, I don't want to say their names right now, were studying at Brandeis University. And their teacher was a man called Harold Marcuse. Now, Harold Marcuse was a disciple of Marx and Lenin. No, not Lenin, Marx and Engels. In fact, Marcuse himself, a German Jew, was a real student of Engels. You all know who Engels is, no? Marx and Engels, the 2 founders of the communist philosophy. And he came as a refugee to America and became a professor at Brandeis. Now, it happened that the 4 students who succeeded me as leaders, I was president for 3 years, the 4th year, they started studying Harold Marcuse. And Harold Marcuse was a dedicated Marxist-Leninist. He is also Angela Davis's teacher, actually. And all of a sudden, when I was president, it was called Journal of Ethiopian Student Association America. We're writing articles about Ethiopian language, Ethiopian religions, Giz literature, Ethiopian church history, religions, and we're writing about just pragmatic things. Then my successors, after they were exposed to Harold Marcuse, and I'll tell you, this is important. Many people don't know this. The root of some of our problem today. The students of Marcuse said, no, we need to overthrow the emperor. We need to revolutionize Ethiopia. This is in 1963-64. And so they came to me and they said, could you give us a blueprint of this journal? So I gave it to them and said, we're going to change the name of it. What to call it? Challenge. And then Challenge. And then they contacted students in Addis Ababa and they said, we're going to start Challenge, and you call it Tiggle or something like that. So the root of what is going on today, in my judgment, for anybody who studies, goes back to that early 1960s, when all of a sudden young Ethiopians were being exposed to socialism, Marxism philosophy, and they started denigrating Ethiopian culture. In fact, I wrote an article about Ethiopian church for one of my professors, and I showed it to some of them. He said, oh, do we have Shakespeare? Do we have Molière? Do we have Goethe? What are these books? This is primitive literature. That insulted me by saying that to me. Then I realized this whole philosophy of Marxism, Leninism, ironically, the majority of Ethiopians in America remained working with me on the literature camp, especially the women who were so kind, always preparing all over at Harvard, at Yale, at Cornell, at UCLA, at Utah, everywhere, raising money for the literacy campaign. And yet, the minority You see, always the minority that speaks loud wins out. We were almost 90% working for literacy campaign, but that 10% of people started having a lot of influence on Ethiopians who study in Europe. And in Paris also there was Marxism, Leninism, and in Europe, in Ethiopia also, and the Tigel, and then as you all know, the whole idea, for instance, like the essays about nationalities and so on and so forth were being written, and the essays were written about overthrowing the emperor, very hateful articles about ourselves. You know,
Yes.
our original idea is based on our self-love, love of our country, love of our people, love of our ancestors and so on. Yet this new generation, however, was a complete hate of the history of Ethiopia, a complete hate. I remember when I said I'm doing this, they thought they were laughing at me. They were laughing at me. Why are you doing these primitive things? In any case, so the root of the problem we face now goes back to those days. And then, as you all know, when it's very interesting. There was a man called Ambassador Birhanu Dinke. Ambassador Birhanu Dinke. I mean, I'm going to the root of the problem that I have. Was a very distinguished Ethiopian church scholar. He was married to the emperor's relative, I understand, if I remember correctly. So he was sent as ambassador to Washington. Now, because I was studying his literature, Ambassador Dinke was a scholar and was like a Daptara at one time. We became very good friends, and I was sharing ideas with him. But then after a couple of years, he, I think, got into a fight with the emperor and decided to leave the embassy. And in fact, by declaring that the emperor is a dictator or something like that, in 1963, I think, or 64, if I'm not mistaken. And by the way, it always amazes me. There's always a miracle, and God sometimes protects me. What happened is Ambassador Dinke called a press conference in which he declared that the emperor of Ethiopia is a dictator. I don't know exactly what he was going to say. And because he knew that my three successors, I don't want to say their name, but another time I'll tell you, he telephones them and me to come to the press conference on a Wednesday. Now, the telephone to me did not come to me. It went to a Professor Harold Isaacs, a professor of architecture at Harvard. So by this time, the three others have gone and stood next to Ambassador Birhanu Dinke, declaring Ethiopia a dictatorship and overthrow the emperor. And I was, as I said, I loved Ambassador Birhanu, and because of it, and he loved me too. And so why didn't I go there? In fact, if he had called me, I would have been in a very difficult situation to say, no, I should have gone. But what happened is, because God was saving me from this political mess, the phone that was called, when the secretary of Ambassador Dinke called Harvard and said, I'd like to talk to Isaac, well, why should an ambassador call a student? He calls a professor. So they connected him to Professor Harold Isaacs. So after all this happened, a couple of days later, Professor Harold Isaac calls me and says, cousin. And I said, cousin, who are you, sir? I'm Professor Isaacs of architecture. By the way, you have a call from the Ethiopian ambassador. By this time, of course, the whole thing had happened. So that's why I didn't show up. However, that is another landmark. I'm telling you something about the historical background of the problems we face today. So then this whole thing developed, and by the late 60s, when our literacy campaign, in fact, was collecting so much money, the student organization was not getting money. They came to me and said, give us 25% of this money. And I said, look, we collected this money in the name of poor Ethiopians. We collected it legally, American tax exemption. So how can I do that? I said, but the majority has to decide. So at the meeting, when they brought it up, I remember the leader got up and said, well, the way to help the people of Ethiopia is not through literacy campaign, but through revolution. And when I said, well, but we have a legal obligation because this money is collected, well, never mind, we'll do something about that. Well, I was shocked. But in any case, luckily I'd worked that summer at Harvard and I had $400. In those days, even $1 is a lot of money. And I said, here, I am a founder of the student movement. I don't want it to die. I gave you 1/4 of what I earned this summer. But don't ask money from poor Ethiopians for the money collected from the literacy campaign. Anyway, I'm just telling you a long story. Then it happened that the Challenge magazine started publishing articles in which there was really an attack on Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian tradition. I myself wanted, progress, but through education, through hard work. Then by late 90s, by late 1690, the whole complete system, while a lot of them remained with me on the education basis, became a vocal, strong, and then even in Addis Ababa University, students started this Tiggle magazine and they started writing this article. And then in 1973 or 74, when the revolution came, I can tell you, almost everybody who came and became leaders in that revolution were people who were here with me. But at the time, they were more for, like Sanai Like he stayed in my house for 2 weeks. Sanai Like was killed, the revolution. Mallas Ayalo took the editorial of the Ethiopian Journal from me. He was a friend of mine. He became a member of the Politburo. So what I'm trying to say is what happened is after mid-1960s, when students of Marcuse started becoming so influential for the minority, actually not a majority, of Ethiopians who believed in Marxism, Leninism, after they got into a tremendous influence among younger people, that led to the revolution of 1974. And I myself never changed my roots about the solution of Ethiopia is education. And in fact, after 1974, that's the only time I used to go to Ethiopia twice a year because of the literacy work I was doing, 3 times a year. But then after 1974, for almost 15 years, I didn't go to Ethiopia because I was saddened how everything was in a rush. And it sounded like to me, we're in a rush to change everything. We're in a rush to revolutionize everything. One thing I was happy about is our literacy campaign was taken over by the Derg people, and they started working on that. I'm grateful for that because they contributed to that. But nonetheless, so I have seen the evolution of our student movement from one that was based on unity, love, peace, hard work for our country, to one that says power comes out of the barrel of the gun, and the shooting and the killing of the 60 people, ministers, the first year of the red terror, it's called. All of this, I know personally firsthand how this whole thing evolved. And then, although the Marxism-Leninism philosophy has kind of dwindled after the Soviet Union had fallen apart, still I think many of our political leaders are students of Marx, Lenin, are students of Hobbes, students of Machiavelli especially. It looks like maybe Marxism-Leninism is no longer tenable, but Machiavelli's philosophy of how power is directed. So we need, the last word I'll say is to reflect upon this. Maybe in our country we say nisahagabu. We need nisahagabu. We need to confess really our mistakes. If we are willing to do that, if we are willing to confess the mistakes we've committed, respect our own tradition, now start listening, studying the history of our peoples, all the peoples of Ethiopia, and then listening to their wishes, their desires, maybe a new day will come. Because I'm afraid even now we continue to be influenced by Western, if not Marxism, Leninism, by Western ideologies, which the majority of our people do not understand. That's my understanding. That's my understanding of the root of our problem. If people disagree with me, I'll be happy to debate with them about it, because I have all this literature in my house also from the literacy campaign day.
Yeah. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor. People are loving this conversation and they have many, many questions, which, however, we don't have time right now to go over those, but we will definitely have you back and continue this conversation, because it is definitely a conversation worthy of having. And we really, at least for me, I really appreciate how you summed up what it means to be Ethiopian in a concrete way. So me, especially me and my generation, could better understand what that means. And also being able to understand that most of our problems that we're facing right now come from a lack of education, and that our inability to go and do our own research and understanding that books and ideas and ideologies are available in Ethiopia by Ethiopians, but we're kind of jumping from then and just going into European perspectives and trying to bring that into Ethiopia as if we don't already have those ideologies in place to solve our own problems. So this was really amazing for me, and even understanding the different relationships between the languages in Ethiopia, because I did grow up in Ethiopia and I did learn in Ethiopian until about 9th grade. And my understanding of the different languages is how outside of Amharic and Tigrinya, everything else was separated. So even having that understanding now will give me, and I hope all our viewers, a better understanding of looking at Ethiopia in a holistic and kinder way of looking at it. And I really appreciate how you said, Mr. Hagabu, that's definitely, understanding that we all make mistakes and starting over and being willing to learn and listen from each other is what we need right now in our country, and even living in the diaspora and having a better and kinder view of our homeland back in Ethiopia. And if Diakon Ephraim has anything to add to this.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Hewitt, and I consent with everything you have said. Just to collaborate, maybe reiterate what you said በአማርኛ ለተመልካቾቻችን ወንድሞችና እህቶች በጣም እናመሰግናለን ከኛ ጋር ስለቆያችሁ። እንዲሁ ለማስተዋወቅ ያህል ነው ታላቅ አባታችን ፕሮፌሰር ኤፍሬም ይስሐቅ ጋር እንደገና በአማርኛው የአደባባይ ሚዲያ ፕሮግራም ላይ ይዘናቸው እንቀርባለን። እሱን ለመናገር ያህል ነው። With that said, before I go to my final thoughts, I'm kind of I wanted to ask a question about if your Professor Ephraim, if your wisdom comes with a special precious name named Ephraim, but I'm kind of tempted to ask that, but we don't have time. Maybe I should ask that next time. But Professor Ephraim, with your final thoughts, if you especially for our younger generation that are just getting to know you, one question, maybe just as a whole question, one, if you could talk a little bit about your new book, which we are showing right now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, Ethiopian Christian Tarik in English. If you could touch on that a little bit, and then also tell us a little bit about, again, maybe this is not new, of course, to a lot of us that have grown knowing you and learning from you, but for the new generation that are just meeting you today, they might think that what the clothing you're wearing today, the style of your clothing or Habesha Kamis, you're just doing it maybe for an interview today, but this happens with you every single day. So if you could talk a little bit about how that came about to be and your experience in that, and your final thoughts, Professor. Again, it has been an honor, Professor, to be with you.
Thank you. Well, I am very pleased that you showed that book. As I said before, the beginning of knowledge is self-understanding. I am a person who is interested in the study of the languages of Ethiopia. I know a lot of Oromo proverbs, and I have reviewed books written on Oromo proverb. But I also believe that it's important that people understand the history of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church because it has been a prominent player in the Ethiopian history, and also because I was influenced by my father, Jewish person, and I discovered that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the most Jewish of all the Christian churches. It's more closely related to ancient, the early church. And so, as I explained, in fact, I said, if somebody asks me why does someone like me who follows the religion of Abraham, religion of Judaism, write such a book, I say it's because I discovered that the Church of Ethiopia is deeply rooted itself in Judaism more than any other church I know. You know, the music, the chantings, the even the chanting of the Ethiopian church is compared to the chanting of the Jews of Yemen. The literature, the practices of the Ethiopian church, circumcision, not eating pork. It's really the only church in the world that is very Jewish in its stance. So I have great respect for that church, and I continue, and I've written. I also translated the book of Enoch, which was preserved in Greek, and another book called the Book of Yosef, Zenahu Yosef, also from Ge'ez into, and recently I helped translate Christos Samra, and that's on actually online. The others have been published. So it's a rich literature. But I also hasten to add that all the peoples of Ethiopia, even orally, they have very important, rich moral teachings, like Proverbs. One of the books of the Bible I love is Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And if you listen to a lot of the Oromo language, the Proverbs in the Oromo language, they're almost like the Proverbs of Solomon. And so understanding oneself is understanding our own people, understanding the history of the Ethiopian church, understanding the history of the Gada people, the democratic concepts of the Gada. It brings us together. Yeah, and it also enriches our mind because, you see, our mind expands when we bring in knowledge from different sources. Well, I don't know the last word, and I appreciate you asking me these questions. My last word is, if what I said offended anybody, I ask your apology. If what I said confused anybody, please, I'll try to explain it another time. I thank both of you, my brother and sister, for your patience with me, because I tend to give long answers, and I do that because unfortunately the questions you ask me are highly loaded. They are books, many of them, and especially my friends who were with me in the early 60s, and if they get offended by my criticism of their conversion to Marxism, Leninism, and misdirect of young people, I apologize. I actually myself like Marx. I have no problem. The problem I have is with people like Lenin and Mao, who said power comes out of the barrel. I'm a pacifist. Therefore, if we can follow Marx's teachings and maybe share everything, that's fine with me. But if we are going to do that by forcing people at the barrel of the gun, then I am parting ways. I don't believe in power. I don't believe in guns. I don't believe. I don't even have a gun in my house. Somebody comes to shoot at me, and I'll only ask them, "Why are you shooting me?" I'm a peace-loving person, basically, and I think our people too, the people of Ethiopia. You know, in the Ethiopian Christian gospel, it talks about peace and even love your enemy, and if we offend each other, it says forgive each other. Not only 7 times, it says 7 times 70, and even the Ethiopian priests teach that. So if we really go back to the traditions of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, to the oral literature of the Oromo, the Gurage, and the Somali, and learn from their wisdom, then maybe we'll have a future. And I'd like to appeal to our younger people. Of course, continue reading the books you read. I don't want to stop anybody from reading Marx, Hobbes, and so on. But please start also reading books that are about Ethiopian cultures, about and then maybe talk to people, learn the proverbs, the oral proverbs our people have. What else can I say? I thank you, my brother and sister, for your patience. And as I said, if I said anything that was unclear, I'll try to make it clearer another time. If I said anything offensive, please forgive me. I'm not a person who offends people. I respect people. I'm a person who believes that live and let live. I respect even whatever I said about Western culture. I have a lot of Western culture. I've lived in it and I've benefited from it. So, but however, as an Ethiopian, first Ethiopian, then Western culture. And I know I studied Western philosophy. It's one of my first degrees. So I'm all for knowledge about China, about India, about, I believe in knowledge. Knowledge is very important. But the beginning of knowledge is self-understanding. And the end of it is the beginning of knowledge is also the fear of God. Our people, the people of Ethiopia, are God-fearing people, are moral people, whether they're Oromo, Amhara, Tigray, Gurage, Somali, Afar, they are really God-fearing people. And therefore, let us learn, let us kneel at the feet of our own elders and show them respect and move forward. That way, we can become one. What it means, that is what it means for me to be an Ethiopian, to come together in love, regardless of our height, regardless of the color of our face, but living on one piece of land that God gave us, those highlands, mountains, whatever, valleys. Let us love each other. Let us work together. That is what peace means. Amen.
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 With that said, Hewitt, if you don't have anything to say, I would not want to add any more words with from what Professor had said. With all the humility and wisdom, it's pretty much that 1 hour and 45 minutes with you has been reading more than one book or 3 books in a bundle at 1 hour and 45 minutes, and we appreciate you for being with us. And we would love to have you again. And brothers and sisters that have been with us from around the world, Adebabai Media family, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining the conversation. Let's keep moving the conversation forward about Ethiopia. And we will have our professor again next time with English. Maybe in the future, if we study Giz, we probably will have a Giz conversation with Professor.
Absolutely.
That should be one of our goals, especially after today.
Yes.
With that said, thank you. And from our Viewers Digest, thank you for being with us.
Well, I'll say, Salam alaikum. يا ملاكنا يبارككم ويقبكم كل يوم كل ليلة. And I will say waaqayyo sina eebbisu ijoollee keenya waaqayyo sinii wajjina ta'u nagaatti taa'a wahee waaruu yaa qanneelli kullu እግዚአብሔር ይባርክክሙ ይጠብቅክሙ ነጋት ሰላም ሻሎም
Amen. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you.